Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the wonderful book, The World's Greatest Ghosts by Roger Bohr. Once again, delving into chapter 6, this time part 3, with the title of the entire chapter being called Ghosts of Royals and Rulers. So we've already seen some notable examples associated with ghosts of royalty and the way they haunt certain walls and certain homes. This particular part 3 will continue that trend. In fact, it's going to have to do with something involving a tower and the years of it being back up to 700 years ago. Amazing stuff. That's why I love this book here, because it definitely shows a wide gamut of examples. I mean, from the very old to the new, from the lesser known ghosts to some of the more prominent ones. You definitely get a full range here. So without further ado, this segment is called The Bloody Tower. History of horror goes back 700 years. And here's what it says. The Tower of London's ancient battlements, colorful beefeaters, and legendary ravens attract millions of tourists each year from all over the world. They stroll the picturesque buildings and courtyards and listen enthralled as guides bring to life the spectacular and violent happenings that shaped Britain's past. For the Tower was once the most blood-drenched spot in England, and for more than 700 years it has had the ghost to prove it. The first, in 1241, was that of St. Thomas Becket, who had been murdered at Canterbury Cathedral back 71 years earlier. Becket was a Londoner and had been constable of the Tower before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. His spirit was seen by a certain priest, a wise and holy man. It was said to have returned to demolish extension walls which were upsetting people who lived near the tower. The priest saw the apparition strike the walls with a cross, whereupon they fell as if hit by an earthquake. Later tower ghosts had more personal reasons for returning to the London landmark. Anne Boleyn, the second of Henry VIII's 6 wives, is the most frequently seen spirit. Several sentries have spotted her over the years, and one even faced a court-martial because of her. He was found unconscious outside the king's house on a winter's night in 1864 and was accused of falling asleep on the watch. At the hearing, he told how a strange white figure had emerged from the dawn mist. It wore a curious bonnet which appeared to be empty. The private who served with the King's Royal Rifle Corps challenged the figure 3 times, but it continued to move towards him. When he ran the bayonet of his rifle through the body, a flash of fire ran up the barrel and he passed out. 2 other soldiers and an officer told the court-martial they had seen the apparition from a window of the nearby Bloody Tower. After hearing that incident had taken place just below the room where Anne Boleyn spent the night before her execution for adultery on May 19, 1536, the court-martial cleared the unfortunate sentry. Anne, queen for 1,000 days, had a horror of English steel and English hands, and her husband agreed to import a French executioner with a French sword for the beheading. But after her death, there were no more niceties. Her headless body was bundled into an old arrow chest and buried in unseemly haste in the Tower Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Sentries had often seen her ghost pacing up and down outside the tiny church, and one night, one of the guards noted an eerie light shining from inside the chapel. He climbed the ladder to peer through a window and saw a ghostly procession of knights and ladies in Tudor dress file slowly up the aisle, led by a woman who looked like Anne. When she reached the altar, they all vanished, leaving the chapel in darkness again. Anne's restless spirit does not confine itself to the scene of her death. Her headless body is said to arrive in a phantom coach at her childhood home, Blickling Hall, Norfolk, on the anniversary of her execution, and she has also been reported wandering through the grounds and attics of Rochford Hall, Essex, during the 12 days after Christmas. But it is at the Tower where most of her rambles have taken place, often near the time of other executions. At 2 a.m. on February 1915, Sergeant William Nichols and his watch saw a woman in a brown dress with a neck ruff. She walked quickly towards the Thames, which runs past one side of the tower, and then disappeared into a stone wall. 5 hours later, a German spy was shot in the moat, one of 11 executed there during World War I, and was last seen in February 1933 when a guard reported a headless apparition floating towards him close to the bloody tower. The ghosts of 3 other 16th century ladies who lost their heads have also been spotted in the tower. Catherine Howard, the fifth of Henry VIII's wives, was beheaded there in 1542 and has been seen walking the walls at night. Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, reenacts the horrors of her 1541 execution on its anniversary. She was dragged screaming to the block, and the axeman chased her around the scaffold, missing his target 3 times before finally severing her head. Lady Jane Grey, who reigned as queen for only 9 days, has been reported several times. 2 sentries recognized her when they saw the figure of a woman running along the battlements of the inner wall near the Salt Tower at 3 a.m. on February 12, 1954, the 400th anniversary of her beheading on Tower Green, less than 150 yards away. Exactly 3 years later, 2 Welsh guardsmen spotted a white, shapeless form on the Salt Tower, where Lady Jane was imprisoned before her execution at the age of 17. In 1970, a man from Grays in Essex wrote to a London evening newspaper saying his girlfriend had seen what seemed to be a ghost during a visit to the tower. He said the figure of a long-haired woman wearing a long black velvet dress and white cap was standing by an open window in the bloody tower. A large gold medallion hung around her neck. The girl was only one in her party to see the figure, and she said that when she went up to the window, both on the visit and on a later occasion, she found it difficult to breathe. Experts believe she is one of the few people who have seen Lady Jane Grey, but in daylight. Phantom men and children also roamed the tower. In 1890, a sentry describing an encounter so vivid that he nearly died of fright. He was on duty in the Beauchamp Tower when he heard someone call his name. He said, "I turned, and there, floating in midair, was a face, red and bloated, with a loose, dribbling mouth and heavy, lidded, pale eyes." I had often seen it in the history books. It was Henry VIII with all the devil showing in him. I was so scared I did not stop running until I came upon 2 of my comrades. They were beginning to clamor when they suddenly broke off. The face had followed me. The affair was hushed up, and we were all told not to breathe a word that the tower was haunted. During World War I, another sentry reported seeing a ghostly procession pass him near Spur Tower. A party of men were carrying a stretcher bearing the headless corpse of a man, his head tucked in beside his arm. Historians said this was the practice in earlier centuries when bodies were returned to the tower for burial after executions on Tower Hill. The ghost of a former Duke of Northumberland has been seen so often in the battlements between the Martin and Constable Tower that sentries have nicknamed the pathway Northumberland's Walk. Sir Walter Raleigh, the favorite explorer of Elizabeth I, who was imprisoned in the tower by her successor James I and executed on 1618, had also been reported by guards. And 2 little children seen walking the bloody tower hand in hand are believed to be Edward and Richard, the 2 princes allegedly murdered on the orders of the uncle in 1483 so that he could claim the throne as King Richard III. Some of the tower's many ghosts are not recognizable as personalities. The keeper of the Jewel House, Major General H.D.W. Sitwell, woke one morning in 1952 in his quarters in St. Thomas's Tower on the outer wall to see a monk in a brown habit or a brown outfit through the open door of his bedroom. Some of the ghosts are not even human. In October 1817, Edmund Swift, then keeper of the Crown Jewels, was dining with his wife, son, and sister-in-law in his parlor in Martin Tower. As he offered his wife a glass of wine, she exclaimed, "Good God, what's that?" He followed her startled gaze and saw a cylindrical glass tube about as thick as a man's arm and filled with white and blue liquid which seemed to be constantly churning. It hovered between the top of the table and the ceiling, moving slowly from one person to another until it passed behind Swift's wife, pausing over her right shoulder. She crouched and clutched her shoulder, shouting, "Oh Christ, it seized me!" And then Swift lashed out at the cylinder with a chair, then rushed upstairs to check that the couple's other children were all right. When he returned, the apparition had vanished. Only days later, a sentry outside Martin Tower watched vapor pour through the narrow gap between the closed door and sill and then took the shape of a giant bear. The guard lunged at it with his bayonet, but the cold steel passed through the figure and then stuck in the wooden door. The man collapsed from shock and never ever recovered. When Swift visited him the following day, he declared him changed beyond recognition, and within days the sentry was dead. The tower has also seen its share of mischievous spirits. Several yeoman warders have found themselves bundled out of bed in one particular small bedroom in the Well Tower. In the autumn of 1972, a photographer was sent tumbling from a ladder as he set up his camera to take pictures of a mural in the Beauchamp Tower room where Lord Lovat, the last Tower prisoner to lose his head, had been held. Perhaps the most curious fact about the Tower of London hauntings is that none have ever been reported in the White Tower, the largest and oldest of all the old buildings and the heart of the entire complex. Guy Fawkes, the man who tried to blow up the House of Parliament in 1605, was just one of the celebrities incarcerated there in cruel conditions before his gruesome death, but none have ever returned to the scene of their ordeals. Masons restoring one of the walls in the late 1850s may have uncovered a clue to the reason for that. In the 11th century, when work on the White Tower began, it was believed that buildings could be protected against malevolent spirits by sacrificing an animal in them. 8 centuries later, the repairmen broke into one of the thickest stone walls and then found the skeleton of an ancient cat. And then there's a little mini segment that's called Bodici's Return. Some of the oldest names in Britain's history books have emerged from the mists of time to appear as ghosts more than 1,000 years after their deaths. The warrior Queen Boadicea poisoned herself in AD 62 to avoid capture after her army was routed by the Romans. But on some mornings earlier this century, she was seen at the small village of Cameringham, north of Lincoln, with 2 phantom horses pulling the chariot from which her hair and gown pillowed behind her. The village is so close to the old Roman road, it's by Ermine Street. When the Romans withdrew from East Anglia in AD 410, Ella was crowned the regent's king, and the people of Horning, near Norfolk, say his ghostly coronation is reenacted every 5 years on July 21st besides the River Bure. The boy King Edward was murdered by his stepmother, Queen Elfrida, in AD 979, and his body taken to Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset for burial. So many miracles happened while it was being transported that the boy later became Saint Edward the Martyr. Several people claim to have seen him being carried up cobbled Gold Hill in Shaftesbury by 2 ghostly men leading phantom pack horses. At Tamworth Castle, Staffordshire, the figure of Edith, a granddaughter of King Alfred the Great, has been sighted climbing the stairs to the tower room, wearing her black nun's habit. Her sighs and moans have been captured on a tape recorder. And then that's it. That'll wrap up everything associated with Chapter 6, Part 3, once again called Ghosts of Royals and Rulers. There's still going to be, I think, one more part, and then maybe another, and then the chapter will wrap up. But let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. Wow, when the chapter was talking about the Bloody Tower and having so many hauntings that they go back 700 years, they weren't kidding. I mean, it was almost like every paragraph had a single separate haunting. Again, that's why I love this book, because by the time I finished this segment here, there must have been well over a dozen specific hauntings to talk about. But interesting stuff. Whatever this tower area is, the Tower of London's ancient battlements, if you want ghost examples, if you want ghost encounters, evidence, it is there. I mean, my goodness, from Anne Boleyn involving one of the second of Henry VIII's wives haunting that location, to another one involving a guy named St. Thomas Becket, who apparently hated that wall or whatever the extension was and then drew it down with some kind of strike from his cross. And then on top of that, there's another one involving another restless spirit, Sergeant William Nichols, who apparently saw what he described as a woman, like a headless woman in a brown dress with some kind of neck ruff, and then countless soldiers that also saw a restless spirit involving another headless body, at one point charging towards the man and causing him to strike her with his weapon and then caused some fire to go into him and then caused him to pass out. Everyone thought that he was asleep at the watch, but luckily he had two other witnesses who saw the exact thing. And then if you wanted more horror, apparently there's a floating cylinder of some sort that goes to guests one by one. Then there's apparently the figure of some ghost involving a bear. Wow, that came out of nowhere, right? Here you have a bear that apparently starts attacking people as well, to the point that it causes their death afterward. And then finally, there was another ghost involving a long-haired woman, again, a black velvet dress, and then another one involving King Henry VIII, but the head associated with him. So it's like one after the other, after the other, after the other, and so many spirits. I haven't even talked about the mischievous ones. And then finally, another one associated with an incarcerated man, and so on. So it's just so many examples. It was interesting to see about Sir Walter Raleigh as well. I was just talking about him on the I believe it was not Gruesome and Grotesque. It was on the urban legend side, if I'm not mistaken. No, I'm sorry. It was on the mysteries and disappearances. And that one, it looks like he crossed over here on the ghost and spirit side too. So let me know what you guys and gals think. Have you ever been to that specific spot? Again, it's known as the Tower of London's ancient battlement ground. Apparently there's one that's called Trader's Gate at the Tower of London if you want to find it there as well. Lots of examples. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.